the gift of life. It is important that we give these gifts to those in need because the recipient could be an angel or even Jesus himself.
Writer-director Eric Penikoff's second feature, The Leech, did not emerge from a vacuum, so it is worthwhile briefly examining the way that it builds upon thematic associations found in Penikoff's earlier works. Penikoff's first short film, The Pod from 2013, might seem the odd one out in his oeuvre, for where his other works are down and dirty, grounded in the grubby realities of human relations, The Pod opens in space, with the vessel of the title shooting through the cosmos, and against some beautifully stylized matte backgrounds. This ship comes with a very particular shape, its bulbous head and tapered tail closely resembling a swimming spermatozoan, as though its forward propulsion through the heavens were also an irresistible drive of male biology. On board, the middle-aged Eugene is woken from his long hibernation by the ship's onboard computer, and struggles to regain control as the spacecraft's thermal shield starts collapsing. These strange, panicky sequences are impressionistically intercut with flashbacks to terrestrial scenes of Eugene having passionate sex with his younger lover Shelley and being faced at home with recriminations from his older wife Deborah. Scenes that the female voice of the onboard computer expressly recognises as a stream of guilt that haunts Eugene. It is almost as though Eugene's current predicament in space and his erotic crisis back on Earth are one and the same event, expressed in different generic languages. In this sophisticated short, a man who has been sleepwalking through the problems in his marriage is suddenly shaken from his slumber. The spacecraft here is an escape pod, where Eugene is in a fugue state, desperate to fly away from his problems and to avoid confrontation with his wife about his priapic extramarital dalliances. Yet as the ship's shields, Eugene's emotional defences, collapse, honesty is demanded, and he must finally admit to his adultery, no matter how painful the confession. This psychological dimension allies the pod closely with the Leech, despite the differences in genre. For the Leech is also about a man whose repressed secrets drive him into a kind of fugue state of delusion, where he gradually loses touch with ground control. Made in the same year as The Pod, Penikoff's second short film, M is for Mariachi, is a very different prospect. A cheaper and scuzzier piece than Penikoff's more abstract-mannered debut, this was selected out of 3,000 entries as one of the 26 runners-up to be included in ABC's of Death 2.5. And it is made very much in the house style of the films in the ABC's of Death series, with their low budgets and macabre punchlines. It follows a man unhappily dragged to an underground death metal concert, literally underneath a Mexican restaurant, only to be rescued by a murderous mariachi trio who treat him to their own, more appealing performance. Himself a massive metal fan, Penikoff here pokes fun at the excesses of the death metal scene and pits two irreconcilably different forms of music against one another in a hilariously violent duel. It is a motif that Penikoff would resume in his feature debut Sadistic Intentions from 2018, in which a promising young woman goes to a mansion lured by the offer of a cheap drug deal and waits there with a musician for her dealer to arrive.
Can I hear a song?
Only to realise that both these men have hidden intentions towards her, the one erotic, the other murderous. Her two pursuers are both members of an extreme metal band and hope, as one of them puts it, to be pushing the boundaries of the genre to create something new, something different, something dangerous, which matches Penikoff's aspirations for a film that veers violently between romantic comedy and killer thriller. So this feature is as much about the darker side of the creative process as about the misogynies buried in metal. But the use of loud head-banging music as a source of irritation and disruption is a motif that Sadistic Intentions shares not only with M is for Mariachi, but also with The Leech.
Oh, the devil
don't know my name. I'm gonna go finish up, man.
For in the Leech, the heavy metal music of the house guest Terry constantly interrupts the life of his host, the priest Father David, preventing him from getting to sleep and also drowning out his recording of a musical piece with the church pianist Rigo. Meanwhile, the piece that David was recording with Rigo comes with its own inner conflict. David regards their recordings as Christian outreach, and with a typically po-faced turn of phrase that makes him sound like an out-of-touch dad as much as a father of the church, he says of Rigo that he, quote, has a certain urban appeal kids find exciting. Yet while Rigo's redemptive patter about finding God, all set to a basic beat track, is clearly rap, Father David is just as clearly uncomfortable with the term rap and its ungodly associations. David prefers to identify the piece as church music, and Rigo's style of delivery as, quote,
warm, welcoming flow.
Terry, who always reduces everything to the lowest common denominator, is quick to pick up on a sexual angle in David's evasive expression.
I got a warm flow.
Terry says, with a nod and a wink to his girlfriend Lexi. Rigo's rap may be concerned with how he abandoned his addictions by turning to God, but Terry finds a way to flip things right back towards the earthly and the appetitive. Other music too enters this conflict between the pious and the profane. When David confiscates Terry's metal collection, he lets him know that there is a box of old gospel tapes in the attic, an offer which Terry sees more as a threat than a blessing.
No, thank you.
Meanwhile, all the increasingly tense and deranged goings-on in the Leech are ironised by an extra-diegetic soundtrack of upbeat Christmas tunes to match the film's Yuletide setting.
What do you think?
Sadistic Intentions has several other things in common with the Leech. For as well as both films being essentially three-handers, they also both star real-life couple Jeremy Gardner and Taylor Zautke, in the former as the would-be lover Stu and the entrapped Chloe, and in the latter as the metal-loving bum Terry and his girlfriend Lexi. Of course, Gardner is a filmmaker in his own right, having written, directed and starred in The Battery and After Midnight, and also directed and starred in Tex Montana Will Survive, and he is a familiar face from many independent American genre titles. In The Leech, Gardner forms an odd couple with fellow indie actor Graham Skipper as Father David. Terry plays seductive Satan to David's prim Jesus, and id to David's ego, even as the dynamic between them subtly switches back and forth. It is also something of a reunion, as the two actors have previously shared the screen in Joe Begos's The Mind's Eye and Bliss, and in Mickey Keating's Psychopaths. Here both performers are at the top of their game and play off each other perfectly, Gardner all uncensored appetite, and Skipper embodying pious repression. The Leech opens in a church in the week leading up to that most holy day in the Christian calendar, Christmas. There is Father David, delivering a sermon at the altar. He is speaking about the golden rule, about doing unto others as you would have them do to you. He's speaking about helping strangers, any of whom might after all be an angel or a prophet, or even Jesus himself in disguise. He is speaking about hospitality and charity. When we help others, he says, we bring them face to face with God by bringing them face to face with us. At the end of his sermon, a sly cutaway will reveal that there are only 4 people seated in this cavernous space. At this point, the film's title will flash on screen in an arresting white on red to the accompaniment of jarring metal wails. There is a discordancy here, and not just a musical one, as though the strobing visuals and raucous sounds of the title are giving expression to the rage and despair that lurk beneath Father David's seemingly benign, placid surface. Those 4 parishioners are all that David has left as audience to his gospel, and he clings desperately to them, even if, as they file out of the church, they fail to acknowledge in any way both his kind words to them and indeed his very existence. In fact, it is they who do not exist.
Father, the place is empty again.
And as the film progresses, we're made to realise that David's congregation has long since dwindled to a literal vanishing point.
You're up there talking to imaginary people. Yo, there's nobody there. It's just me.
Similarly, although David posts regular sermons online in the hope of reaching a broader audience, Rigo appears to be their only reader too. For in this house of God, where in any case David would only ever be preaching to the choir, he is also preaching to the void.
God be with you.
his biblical lessons falling on deaf ears because there is no one actually there to hear his words. Perhaps only God is listening, unless he too is a mere delusion. That last point is key, for The Leech is a film about one man's crisis of faith, as the verities and certainties of his religious beliefs come crashing into an unaccommodating reality. In this respect, it has a lot in common with films as otherwise varied as Robert Bresson's Diary of a Country Priest, both Masahiro Shinoda and Martin Scorsese's respective versions of Silence, William Friedkin's The Exorcist, Roland Joffe's The Mission, Antonia Bird's Priest, Paul Schrader's First Reformed, John Michael Madonna's Calvary, and Mark O'Brien's The Righteous. For like these films, The Leech confronts its priestly protagonist with the complications and compromises of the real world, a world which is sometimes cold, callous, and cruel. Still, even after Rigo has left, David is not in fact entirely alone in the church, for he discovers a man who has wandered in seeking refuge from the wintry temperatures outside. Terry had slept on one of the pews through David's sermon, and although David insists, as he locks up the church, that Terry leave, he also sees in this lost sheep an opportunity to practice what he preaches. So he first invites Terry, who is waiting outside in the cold for a ride, to stay warm in his car, and he then proposes giving him a lift to what Terry calls his chick's house. And then, when it becomes clear that Terry has been kicked out and is now homeless, David offers him a room for the night in his own home. That night will turn into the entire Christmas week, with Terry's girlfriend Lexi, now herself evicted and unemployed, also taking advantage of David's hospitality and moving in. This is David's chance, having talked the talk of Jesus at altar, at last to walk the walk, helping out those strangers in their time of need, and perhaps even bringing them closer to God.
I would like for you both to have this.
Oh! Who's his bulldog?
That's Mother.
The terrifying old woman in the painting is, as David points out, his dear departed mother. And her painting, as well as an urn containing her ashes, dominate the otherwise bare living room, as though it were a shrine to the most important woman in David's life. Indeed, David lives under his mother's stern, all-seeing gaze. Later, when David is asked to join Terry and Lexi for a drink in the living room, he looks nervously towards the painting, as though imagining his mother's disapproval. And shortly afterwards, Terry will turn the painting around, complaining that, "I feel like she's sitting here with us just judging me." For this home that David has inherited is still very much his mother's house, and even though she died 2 years earlier, David remains under her eyes and thumb. It is an oppressive, suffocating existence, and that suffocation is literalized by the respirator mask that he wears at night to help him breathe while he sleeps. Anyone who has seen Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, or Joseph Ellison's Don't Go in the House, or William Lustig's Maniac, or Neil Blomkamp's Demonic, or Mickey Keating's Off Season, or Addison Hyman's Hypochondriac, will understand the dark shadow that an overbearing mother can cast over a child's psychological makeup, even from beyond the grave. David is a classic mama's boy, and when we see him in his home environment, where the only decorations are crucifixes and likenesses of his mother, we are also seeing the twin influences, church and family, that have made him who he is. A lonely, frustrated man-child struggling to stay in control while suffering a mental breakdown. And if David's mother is gone, another has come in her place, for Lexi is pregnant, and as the increasingly deranged David takes it upon himself to be Lexi's spiritual guide, he insists that she wear an old-fashioned dress that once belonged to his own mother.
I'd like for you to wear it.
He will also, like Norman Bates or other cinematic mama's boys, eventually resort to cold-blooded murder. In certain ways, both church and home are similar locales as the spaces of David's lonely, insulated existence. Much as David hears the intimate aspects of people's lives in the church's confession booth, in his home, some of his own secrets and hidden desires are revealed in a game of Never Have I Ever that Terry and Lexi encourage him to play with them one night.
I love Truth or Dare, but my favorite was always Never Have I Ever.
David may present a front of sanctimonious moral perfection, but Never Have I Ever becomes his confessional, where we glimpse something of his past, his inner life, and his closeted sexuality. As Terry and Lexi persuade David to drain his drinks fast for the game, Terry suggests he, quote, "just pretend it's Jesus' blood, or whatever you do," expressly connecting this activity at home with the communion wine that David distributes for Mass in the church. As David himself puts it, Christ welcomed all into his home. While all good Christians are supposed to model their own behaviour on Jesus's, David's growing conviction that he actually is Jesus, and a hard-fisted, gun-toting Jesus to boot, is more a mark of his insanity and of both a church and a home in collapse. One evening, Lexi is sent home from a job interview at a fast food store with what Terry describes as a whole fuck-ton of chicken, and Terry invites the reluctant Father David to join them for what he calls something like a family dinner. All this places the Leech elusively within a niche cinematic tradition, for the collective consumption of chicken at a family dinner has long been a signifier of deep domestic dysfunction. The ground zero of this association is the chicken dinner from David Lynch's Eraserhead, where the carving of man-made poultry exposes all the grotesque psychosexual tensions within a family. Other films that have picked up on the family chicken dinner motif include James Isaac's Eraserhead-aping House 3, also known as The Horror Show, Alexander Payne's About Schmidt, Sean Byrne's The Loved Ones, and perhaps most memorably, William Friedkin's Killer Joe, which delivers a K-fried bucket load of Southern Gothic, with a family's implosion as the takeaway. In The Leech, at the chicken dinner scene where our unlikely trio chews the bones together, David reveals the circumstances of his first encounter with the man who would become his church assistant, Rigo, whom he says he found sleeping in a truck stop bathroom at night. David's intention is to illustrate the possibilities of redemption and to show how a homeless man can turn his life around if open to God. But Terry is quick to sniff something suspicious in David's anecdote.
That's a real pretty story, David. I'm a little bit hung up on one part.
Terry will say.
What were you doing in that truck stop bathroom?
And so, over this chicken dinner, David's veneer of holier-than-thou respectability begins to unravel. By the end of that same night, David will have got blind drunk, taken hard drugs, and engaged in a vigorous threesome. For the wasted David will interrupt and join Terry and Lexi in their bedroom for the dildo-assisted police-themed role-play game which Terry calls Cocks and Robbers, a name with a resonant reference to the chickens that began the evening and have now come home to roost. The Leech is a Christmas movie, and the miracle of birth is at its centre. A non-religious woman wanders into Father David's church, and in the masked anonymity of the confession booth, tells David that she is pregnant and intends to get an abortion because the father is a lost cause who she says is probably living under a bridge. Alarmed at the prospect of abortion, David reassures her that nothing is a lost cause and begs that she talk to the father.
Choose life.
That evening, Lexi turns up at David's home for the first time, and we, along with David, infer that Lexi is the unseen confessor, who has now come to try to patch things up with her partner Terry. After all, Terry is a homeless deadbeat, who had already expressly told David several times that he sometimes sleeps under a bridge like a troll. So David resolves to let this couple settle their problems under his roof and his Christian guidance. Of course it is more complicated than that. Later, Lexi will insist that she had never once set foot in his church, and that he is confusing her with someone else. But Lexi will claim to be pregnant anyway, and Terry will even suggest that David himself might be the father, saying,
We both popped off in her, remember?
In fact, this cannot be possible. Pregnancy will not show on a test only a couple of days after a conception. And David, though a father of the church, really cannot be the daddy. Still, Terry's suggestion and Lexi's stated desire to get an abortion send David further over the edge, even as he remains determined to protect Lexi's unborn baby from what he considers legalised murder. Paradoxically, he will try to prevent this murder by committing it himself, and will only be persuaded not to kill Lexi too by the baby in her belly, which, like the unborn fetuses in Baby Blood, Prevenge, and Ninja Baby, will speak to him. To David, this is a holy epiphany, and the kind of direct divine intervention for which he has long been praying. But a more obvious, rational reading is that it represents the climax of David's mania. The right to life, the right to choice. These are the fault line issues that polarise America, and they are also the coordinates around which Leech is structured. For Pentecost film offers a dialectic between faith and secularism, while teasing out the contradictions between them. Here, Lexi is the voice for choice, It's my body, she says, and I'm getting it out of me. Meanwhile, the two men, both fathers in different ways, will adopt a typical patriarchal line. To Lexi's indignation, Terry claims that the baby belongs to one or other of the two men, violently dismissing what she wants, while David, who sermonizes several times on his pro-life attitude, shows a willingness to kill, and even to kill an expectant mother, in his unhinged mission to save the baby. Coming out at a time when the 1973 Roe v. Wade decision has just been repealed by the Supreme Court of the United States, and when the constitutional right to abortion has been overruled, the Leech converts the messiness of this ongoing controversy into mad, reeling psychodrama. A leech is a parasitic worm that attaches itself to its host and sucks its blood. It is also used metaphorically as a noun to signify a person who persistently exploits others, or as a verb to denote such clinging activity. As well as being the title of Pennycoff's film, the word leech is uttered twice within its narrative. "We ain't trying to leech," declares Terry as he persuades David to let him and Lexi stay. Yet Terry is the most obvious candidate for the leech of the title, with David his put-upon host. When David gives Terry an inch, Terry takes a mile, literally upgrading his estimate of how far the drive is to Lexi's house from
It's like a 20-minute drive away.
to
Hey, like I said, it's only like a 30-minute drive.
Terry finesses David's offer for him to stay a single night in his house into a week-long stay that will include Lexi too, and by the end Terry is envisaging a more permanent domestic arrangement between the three of them and Lexi's newborn baby. Terry makes himself at home, repeatedly ignoring David's requests that he not smoke in the house, not play profane music, not curse, not drink before dinner, and not do drugs. And Terry even tries to blackmail David into letting them stay, in the ultimate act of disrespect for his host.
How many other boys you brought home?
So Terry is certainly, along with his fellow hanger-on Lexi, a leech in the film. The second appearance of the word leech is much later, when a manic David imagines that the pregnant woman who had earlier appeared in the church's confession booth now returns, this time to confess what she calls her true identity. As the voice shifts from a feminine timbre to something more masculine and unearthly in its distortions, it describes itself with a series of expressions which ally it to a timeless evil, before concluding, this entity is clearly presenting itself as the devil, but is also as a construct of David's hallucinations, a reflection and projection of David himself and his errant psyche. Perhaps, after all, David is the leech. When they first meet and are driving to Lexi's house, David informs Terry that he is celibate. Terry responds, "Oh cool, so like, you've got both parts." This surreal non sequitur shows that Terry is unfamiliar with the word celibate, and is here confusing it with hermaphrodite, something which has both parts. This exchange, early in the film, not only obliquely foreshadows David's later bisexual encounter with Terry and Lexi, but also associates David with leeches, which are indeed hermaphroditic creatures. More to the point, while Terry and Lexi have latched themselves onto David, he's done something similar to them. For while he opens his doors to them, his hospitality comes with a shifting set of very strict rules that allow him to control them and use them to his own ends. So desperate was he earlier for a flock to hear his sermons that he conjured parishioners in his head, but now he has a captive audience at home and makes them submit to his endless proselytizing and biblical rants as a condition of their continued stay. And while David may be hospitable, Terry and Lexi are in fact equally, if differently, generous, sharing with David their food, their drink, their drugs, and even their bed, and happy to make this man of God a part of their own growing godless family. Terry and Lexi need David, but it's not clear that he needs them any less, as a way of realising his self-fulfilling fantasy of spreading the good word and saving lost souls. Ultimately, he will in fact save no one, but suck his guests dry, leaving behind 3 corpses and a now single mother. Indeed, as single as the mothers who raised Lexi and himself, with mixed results.
I snorted, Mama!
In fact, there is, besides the 3 principal characters, one other candidate for the film's titular designation. Near the beginning, when Rigo complains about the lack of worshippers at Father David's sermon, David will reply,
The church is like any living organism. It shrinks and it grows.
Indeed, it is just like a leech, a creature which diminishes in size until it gorges on blood once more. So perhaps the real leech here is the church itself, an organisation which uses fanciful narratives and false promises of heavenly salvation to take over people's lives and drain them of their small secular pleasures. And in all his inauthenticity, hypocrisy, and self-denial, gay, alcoholic David is this Leech's ultimate prophet.
Time to give